Before getting into detailed music theory, I'm going to play excerpts of music where the chordal sonority isn't a simple triad. We'll listen to music from The Matrix first, and then from Captain America. This chord uses the notes F sharp, G sharp, C sharp, and D. You should assume that the root is F sharp. Do you have a name for this type of chord? And let's move to a moment from Alan Silvestri's score to Captain America. In this case, I want you to assume that the lowest note G is the root, and that the chord tones are G, A flat, C, and D. Think about what you might call this type of chord. Trying to connect these moments using tonal theory can get complicated, and with the roots I gave you, these chords would have different names. But there's another way to analyze these that doesn't relate notes to a root. I want to discuss post-tonal theory as an orientation toward music which avoids tonal reference points. Having that sort of orientation can be useful for plenty of situations in both tonal music as well as atonal music. I love using film music as an entry point into this way of thinking, but before going into post-tonal systems, let me clarify what I mean by avoiding tonal reference points. Tonal music involves many musical hierarchies. There's a tonic pitch to which other notes relate, and there are also scales which parse pitch space so that some notes sound like they belong more than others. In addition, chords have their own hierarchy in which notes of a chord relate to the root of the chord, and those chords usually have a framework of stacked thirds. When chords are conceptualized as thirds above a root, we say that the harmony is tertian. And when a tertian chord has a root third and fifth, we call it a triad. Sometimes triads overlap in a way that you might want to call them a polychord, and Don Davis's score to The Matrix is full of them. Here's the first and simplest example of those overlapping triads. If we think in tertian terms, these are triads. One is built on C and the other is built on E. And there's language to describe each of these triads according to a root. The triad on C has a major third and perfect fifth from its root, so we call it C major. The chord on E has a minor third from its root, so we call it E minor. Notice that these terms not only give information in terms of a root and thirds above it, but that those terms don't specify a specific voicing for which octaves the notes should be in. And any combination of C's, E's, and G's will be a C major triad. Any combinations of E's, G's, and B's is E minor. This will be important later. Thinking about chords in relation to roots, thirds, and fifths can get a little challenging when the chords aren't simple triads. In Alan Silvestri's score to Back to the Future, the musical cue, the letter, is saturated by a particular three-note sonority, which I'll highlight each time it occurs. The trouble with tonal language is that I don't have a simple term to summarize that sonority without establishing a root for reference. For the notes C, D, and G, if C is the root, then there's a fifth and a second above it, and we might call it sus2. But if G is the root, and it has the same notes, then there's a fifth and a fourth above it, so we might call it sus4. Both of these terms are useful because they give detailed information about chord function and hierarchy, but they can also obscure the idea that C sus2 and G sus4 have the same notes and a very similar sonority. Post-tonal theory doesn't have very glamorous names, but it allows me to say that this passage is saturated with O27 without needing to decide on a root or even a key, and I'll explain later why I called this particular sonority O27. If you want to stop thinking in terms of tonics, roots, and scales, we can start by measuring distance as a number of semitones. Other tunings and divisions of the octave exist, but that's way beyond the scope of this video. I don't want to be too technical, but I'll use curly brackets when I'm talking about a set of elements without specifying its order, and these carets to refer to a series where order is important. In the matrix, squid-like machines are associated with a cacophony of motivic units that use the interval series +1 measured in semitones. Notice that the interval series defines distance from a starting pitch, but it can begin from any note. Things get interesting once you have a particular intervallic idea or motive and you want to come up with ways of developing it. The next examples come from James Horner's score to Aliens. To get our bearings for what motivic material might be, here's the slithering idea in the strings of the main title. Probably the most intuitive way to think about this is as a repeated note and another line which descends by semitone, especially since a violin literally holds that upper note. In the measures that follow, we can hear a development. There's a repeated 3-note unit against which material descends, but I want to look at this material from another perspective. Let's instead focus on the first 3 quick notes as a motivic unit. Then the interval series is +1 -2, and that little motive becomes thematic throughout the rest of the movie. I'll give a couple ways that Horner works with it. To get it in your ears, here it is on trumpet once, followed by a simple development, adding more notes to it. Having the developed version immediately follow the original makes it easier to hear as a development, but analyzing this new version as an interval series isn't a great way to show the similarity. It's a pretty free development, but you can add on material that sounds more clearly derived from the original. Let's start with the ostinato from the musical cue Futile Escape. This has a cool relationship to that opening slithering. There's a repeated note and another line against it which moves by semitone, but I want to focus on just the last couple notes. The ostinato ends with the thematic interval series +1 -2. After a lot of repetition, Horner lengthens this line by adding on the intervals -2 +1. Since the order of intervals is reversed, you can call that a retrograde of the intervals if you like big words. Another option for development is to invert the direction of the intervals, meaning that +1 -2 now becomes -1 +2. Notice that in each of these examples, adding a note, reversing the order of intervals, or inverting the direction of intervals, James Horner first establishes the original idea and then immediately follows it with a variation using the same instrument. I'm not sure I would have heard all of these as new versions of the motive without having such a clear setup. To go all in on post-tonal theory, you can assign numbers to notes. Set any note as 0, and then the note up a semitone will be 1, the next one will be 2. Once you get to 11, let's make the next note 0 again and treat all octaves as equivalent. There's a mathy term for a space that repeats every 12th unit called modulo 12 or mod 12 for short. Since this is a loop with 12 subdivisions, circular mod 12 pitch space can be represented with clock-like notation. Using two-digit numbers for 10 and 11 can get awkward visually, so I'll use T and E instead. In this circular pitch space, when pitches go up, that'll be clockwise, and when they go down, that's now counterclockwise. And there will be two routes to go to any note. To go from C to G, for example, you can go up a fifth, which is plus 7 semitones, or down a fourth, which is minus 5. This can all seem pretty abstract, so let's dig into Alan Silvestri's score to Back to the Future, which has a recurring three-note motive of minus 7 plus 6. First, you should get that motive in your ears. There's two main musical contexts for this. Here it is in the context of an octatonic pitch collection. And now here's an example of that motive to start a larger theme in a Lydian context. Now I want to illustrate the concept of octave equivalence. If you take that third note and lower it by an octave, now we descend to the same note instead of ascending to it. In the next example, listen to the full orchestra play big three-note units after some string runs. If you hear this as another version of the same motive from before, then you are hearing octave equivalence. There's an interesting detail I left out. The second set of big orchestral hits is not the same intervallic series as the other two. It goes minus 6, minus 7 instead of minus 7, minus 6. If you heard that as yet another version of the same motive, then the interval order itself isn't that important either, or at least the context of the phrase rhythm and orchestration may play a bigger role than specific intervals in determining a sense of equivalence. Either way, in mod 12 circular pitch space, the intervals plus 6 and minus 6 are equivalent because they travel to the same note. Theorists will often use the term pitch class to refer to notes without specifying a particular octave, whereas pitch indicates a note and a specific octave. If I say the note C, that's a pitch class because it could refer to any C, whereas middle C is a specific pitch around 260 Hz. I've been trying to use the term note instead of pitch class to make this video a little bit less technical. If you want to group notes together without specifying whether you're talking about a chord, a scale, a melodic segment, you can use the term set. And this is why pitch class set theory might be a more precise term than just post-tonal theory. One common reason for using octave equivalence is when classifying chord types. We can revisit those chords from the matrix again, but now as pitch class sets. Recall that when I said this was an E minor chord, that term makes no stipulation about which notes are above which, nor the range between the lowest and highest note. The term E minor is an octave equivalent description for a set with the notes E, G, and B. Using mod 12 circular notation, I can represent that chord as a shape on the clock face. But what can we call this chord type as a mod 12 entity? I want a name that covers this particular shape and any transposition of it in the way that the term minor triad could include not just E minor, but also an F minor triad, G minor triad, etc. Since I'm no longer talking about a specific chord, but rather a class of chords that encompasses all possible transpositions, I'll use round brackets for these instances. One option for naming this class of chords is to assign a note of the chord to be 0 and then count semitones up from it. If E is 0, then we have 0, 3, and 7. But we could also set G as 0, and then it would be 0, 4, 9. With B as 0, it's 0, 5, 8. It doesn't make sense to have 3 different names for the same chord type, so theorists use what's called normal form as a way to standardize which of these numbers to use. Normal form picks the most compact numeric version measured from the first to the last digit. In this case, 037 is more compact than the other versions. So that's the normal form of this chord. All this is to say that the post-tonal name for a minor triad is 037. You don't need clock notation to name a post-tonal chord though. Just put the notes in their most compact form and count semitones up from the bottommost note. The class of chords that you know as major triads are now called 047. Right now, this seems like a ridiculous exercise because the terms minor triad and major triad work perfectly well in this situation. So let's check out some times where tonal theory doesn't have such simple terms to use, or where you might not want to make a claim about tonics and roots. That's when pitch class set theory shines. Here's another chord from the matrix. There isn't very much context about what's the root. The notes are E flat, F, and G, and they're already written in a very compact form, so we can set E flat as 0. Then F is up 2 semitones, and G from the original note is up 4 semitones. So we can say that this music, this chord, has the sound of O2-4. I think O2-4 has a rather pleasant sound since it doesn't have any semitones between its notes. Eventually, you'll want to ear train all the possible set types, or at least trichords, so I can start to give you a little bit of practice. In the next example, strings will play in 3-part harmony with a lot of variation in the types of sonority. Before I show you my analysis, see if you can hear which chord is another instance of 0-2-4. This was the chord that's 0-2-4, and here are the other chords given as set types in normal form. Notice that the sustained B flat provides some grounding, but the passage isn't very tonal until the last 2 measures, which come in with more familiar triadic sonorities and ease into E flat minor. Let's switch over now to Alan Silvestri's score to Captain America, which has an iconic 4-note harmony with the notes G, A flat, C, and D. Sometimes this chord occurs in relation to a root C, and other times in relation to G, and it would have different tonal labels for each of those roots. But we don't have to pick a root. In normal form, this chord is 0-1-5-7. If you're not stuck looking for roots of chords, then you can quickly notice that this passage from the matrix has the same sonority of 0-1-5-7. I already introduced the idea of inversion as a way of replacing an interval going up with the same interval value going down and vice versa. But I only did that in pitch space. In mod 12 space, it gets more technical and complicated, probably a little more than I want to go into here. Theorists often use an axis of symmetry to represent inversion of pitch classes, and rather importantly, chords can be inverted by flipping the notes across that axis of symmetry. When defining classes of chords, theorists use the idea of set class as a way of defining not only all transpositions of a chord, but also all the transpositions of an inversion. When I discuss a class of chords like this that includes all possible transpositions and inversions, I'm going to use square brackets without commas. I want to keep this discussion as practical as possible, so rather than thinking about an axis of symmetry, I recommend thinking about a set class according to its interval content, which refers to the total intervals between each pair of notes in the chord. The reason this works really well for talking about set classes is that interval content stays the same once you invert a chord. Even if you don't know how to invert a chord, you can hear interval content to determine if chords belong to the same set class. Let me show you what I mean with a C major triad. Taking the shortest distance between C to E is 4 semitones, from E to G is 3, and from C to G is 5. In tonal terms, that's a major third, a minor third, and a perfect fourth. I can invert the chord, and the inversion will have the same interval content. Each pair is separated by 3, 4, or 5 semitones. Because of the axis of symmetry I happened to choose, I ended up with an E minor triad. But a different axis of symmetry would produce another minor triad. Maybe you'll have a newfound appreciation for these opening chords of the matrix when you keep in mind that major and minor chords have the same interval content and that they are inversions of each other. Limiting ourselves to chords with 3 notes, called trichords, there are only 12 possible trichord set classes, each with its own unique interval content. 0 to 4 has a sweetness to it, whereas 0 to 7 has a slightly more open sound to it. In contrast, 0, 1, 2 is much more biting since it has 2 semitones in its interval content. You can hear a terrifying example of this sonority in a passage from James Horner's score to Aliens, which is fully saturated by set class 0, 1, 2. The strings and woodwinds play short stabs of -1, -1, each of which is 0, 1, 2 expressed melodically. But they all start on different notes, meaning that the simultaneities are also 0, 1, 2. Even the brass line is derived from the motive +1, -2 that we've discussed before, but melodic units turn into the set class 0, 1, 2. It may seem like a lot of work to think about chords as a string of numbers in normal form, but it is something you can and should train, just like learning to hear and identify the common triads and seventh chords of tonal music. Many people get turned off by how mathy all of this may seem, but if you try to get all these numbers in your ears, then it becomes more musical and practical. In the description of this video, I'll link 2 ear training modules that I designed using the full range of orchestral instruments to supplement this material. One module was designed to train hearing all trichord set classes, and the other is about hearing post-tonal intervals in both pitch and pitch class space.